Oh, hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. So, we have made it to the 8th book in Project Poirot, where I am reading every single Hercule Poirot book in the order of publication-ish. Because I think Poirot Investigates probably wasn't that order, but whatever. Basically in the publication order. And yeah, we've made it to number 8, and that is Lord Edgeware Dies, also known as 13 at Dinner. So, as always, this is going to be spoiler free. I can tell you, since it is in the title, Lord Edgeware does in fact die in this book, and so I will kind of take the summary up into that point. But yeah, if you've not read this book, don't worry, you could still watch without getting spoiled. This is a book that takes place in London, and we've got Hastings back again. So he was back in the last one, and he's back again, so he's our narrator. And he and Poirot go for a lovely night at the theater, where they see an actress named Carlotta Adams, who's a great impersonator. So she's doing a variety of different impersonations, including of a very popular actress named, I believe, Jane Wilkinson, and Jane Wilkinson is actually at the performance. So she spots Hercule Poirot, and she asks him if he will do her a favor and go speak to her estranged husband for her, because she's an actress and she's, basically this book describes her as a sociopath. That becomes clear very, very quickly. And she, their marriage has not worked out because he is also basically kind of a sociopath. Like, they found each other, and he basically doesn't want to give her a divorce, but she really, really wants one because it's implied she wants to get married again. So she says, hey, would you just go, like, you're an esteemed man, like, I'd appreciate it if you would just go talk to my husband for me and try to talk him into giving me a divorce. So Hastings and Poirot go to see Lord Edgeware the next day. They run into his daughter, who's kind of weird, and he's got like a very weird secretary, a weird butler. It's just a house basically full of weird people, I would say. It's fair to say. And Lord Edgeware doesn't have a lot of time for them because they're going to Paris. He's going to Paris the next day, but he says, well, what is it that she wants? Why are you here? I know you're a detective. And Poirot kind of lays out Jane's case to him, and he says, well, I don't know why she's asking me for this, because I wrote her months ago telling her that I would go through with the divorce. She just had to initiate proceedings. So that's weird. Weirdness is just the theme here. And so Poirot and Hastings say, oh, okay, well, hey, have a nice trip. And they go back and let Jane Wilkinson know. And she says, oh, okay, well, you know what? Like, I'm going to go out and celebrate. I'm going to go to this dinner I was invited to. This is great news. Like, I can get married. This is fantastic. So, yeah, everybody thinks that that's going to be the end of it. But that night, Jane Wilkinson is seen at Lord Edgeware's house, and then he dies basically the next day, as the title says. And through, things happening the same night, Carlotta Adams also died. So there are two basically murders at play that Poirot is trying to investigate, and he feels particularly driven to solve the murder of Carlotta Adams because she was young and talented, and basically he, I think, feels sort of duty bound to avenge her. So that is sort of the premise of the whodunit. So with that in mind, I have to say I really enjoyed this one. So I read this very late in my Agatha Christie reading career because I had seen the A&E adaptation of it, or really BBC adaptation of it, with David Suchet prior, so I kind of already knew how the story worked out. But I was surprised in reading it just how much I enjoyed it and how skillfully I feel like Agatha Christie at this point in her career is able to manage a large cast of characters. So if you'll remember back to The Mystery of the Blue Train when I reviewed that, basically what I said was half of my problem with this book is the fact that there are too many people and they just are not involved enough in the plot to make how convoluted all of this is justified. This is the opposite of that, because it is quite a large cast of characters in this book. There's a lot going on in this book, but I think that she actually uses the characters' kind of psychology and who they are as people to provide clues as to what's going on in the mystery. And basically, a lot of this is trying to figure out, okay, well, yeah, Jane Wilkinson basically seems like a psychopath, but she was also seen at dinner at the time she was supposed to be killing her husband, she was there, so even if she seems like she has a motive or whatever, like, you know, how is she both at dinner and at this house? And, you know, we kind of get an answer to that pretty quickly, but like, so it's interesting because she's got a very distinctive psychology happening. So does Lord Edgeware. Like, he is described a number of times, and I will say, I think what is being pretty heavily implied in this book is that Lord Edgeware is gay, and that that's a part of his sort of weirdness or psychopathy or whatever. So like, that element of the book does not age well. It doesn't come out and say that at any point, but just like reading between the lines in terms of like how he's described at a few points, and the fact that there's this very effeminate butler who is also sort of painted as kind of morally questionable, I think that that's what we're meant to kind of assume. And I will just say that that element of the book does not age well. So we'll put that out there. But it's interesting because in the context of the moral universe that Agatha Christie is setting up, at this point in time, like, being homosexual, being gay was like anathema. That's not an acceptable place, a thing to act on in her culture, right? So like, she brings that in as a clue or an element of the plot. So there's that happening. And then I think the fact that both Carlotta Adams and Jane Wilkinson are both actresses is very interesting, because they're both taking on roles, and I think that there's a lot of discussion about like sort of the psychology of why one becomes an actress, and I think we're meant to see them as sort of like contrast. So Carlotta Adams sort of becomes an actress, and she's like specifically an impersonator because she's kind of empty, and that's a little harsh, but like, I think we're meant to see her almost as like a vessel in which a character is like filling her up and giving her an identity, as opposed to, I think we're meant to see Jane Wilkinson as like kind of a psychopath who is used to like imitating other people to like fake having real feelings. So it's sort of like contrast there. There's also and you know, I think Jane Wilkinson is very specifically kind of painted as sort of like a narcissist, and that her like she essentially is an actress out of having too much of a sense of self, to the point where she doesn't really empathize with others, and as opposed to Carlotta is seen as sort of an actress because she doesn't have enough of a sense of self. So there's that contrast happening, and I think that the psychology of that is very interesting. I think even just the fact that I'm using the word psychology so much is indicative of the time period, because there's, you know, from Freud forward, there's increasingly sort of these ideas of pop psychology and ideas about the way people are or are not supposed to act based on upbringing and propensities for different illnesses or whatever. Like, I think there's a bigger sense of that, and Agatha Christie is sort of leaning into it. I think we also see quite a bit of kind of discussion about new social mores in the light of divorce. So in the last episode, we talked about divorce as sort of a rising social phenomenon, and I think part of what we see, interestingly, in this book is the fact that, yes, divorce is becoming much more socially acceptable and you know, is legally possible, which is certainly not the case for most of the 19th century. But that being said, the social mores that go along with that have not totally caught up to this becoming an increasingly valid social option for people. So I think that there's some interesting discussions around that. And then I think finally, the other thing that I find very interesting about this book, and part of like why I like it in terms of the project of tracing kind of moral development and also just like social trends through Agatha Christie's work, is I do think that this is another book in which we see a real contrast between old and new. So old and new in the sense of like British versus US, like there's some interesting interplays between the British characters versus the American characters in this book, and Britain as sort of a waning superpower and America as sort of a growing superpower at this point in history. But I also think we see a real contrast between old aristocracy and kind of new aristocracy, and I put that in quotes because, you know, Lord Edgeware, he's a lord, right? And Jane Wilkinson is a lady by virtue of being married to him. But she's also a part of a new aristocracy that's growing, which is actors. So there are several different titled characters in this book, or heirs to titles, and I think that we see a real contrast in how they're discussed and treated in comparison to the actors of stage and film who are growing in popularity and prestige in this time period, and increasingly, especially in America, right? Like, they are our aristocracy, like they are the famous people who we all follow and whatever, and have a lot of like social clout. So I think that that's also an interesting contrast in this book. And even more so than in the previous book, where I talked about how Poirot and Hastings were feeling more like an even partnership, I think we really see that in this book, that they really are behaving a lot more like partners. And it's a shame because Hastings is not going to show up for a whole lot more books, but at this point in kind of their development as characters together, they're much more evenly matched, and I think Poirot shows a lot more respect for Hastings as a person and as a thinker in this book. So there's an interesting little passage where he specifically talks about how Hastings is the embodiment of the normal mind, and I've talked about that previously in other videos, but he actually says that with a degree of respect, because he kind of says, you know, I need you because what you do is you sort of show me what the criminal wants me to think, and that helps me realize what I shouldn't think, basically. And Hastings is sort of like, I'm not sure if that was a compliment, and it isn't totally, but you can tell that Poirot for the first time says that with a much larger degree of respect for Hastings than he has previously. So yeah, just between a lot of like interesting characters and an interesting mystery with a lot of twists and turns and fun kind of reveals, I really enjoyed this book. Like, I gave this a 5 out of 5 on Goodreads, and I would give it a 6 out of 7 on my personal scale. I really enjoyed this much more than I did the first time, I think because I had enough distance between me and when I first saw that BBC adaptation of it to really appreciate the nuances it was bringing. So I really, really enjoyed this one. In terms of where I would like rank it, I would actually put it over the big four. So between the big four and the Mysterious Affair at Styles, I really enjoyed this one in a way that I wasn't necessarily expecting to. And I actually now see how this book really sets up the next book in the series, which is The Murder on the Orient Express. Very famous book, new movie adaptation about to come out about it, and probably her masterpiece. I see now how this book sets up a lot of things that she does really well in The Murder on the Orient Express, because she's managing a large cast very effectively. She has a lot of kind of twists and turns that are interesting. She shows motivation, very credible motivation, maybe more so than previous books, for a variety of different parties to have done the crime. She is using the psychology of the characters to basically be clues to the reader. These are all things that we're going to see in the next one, in The Murder on the Orient Express, which I'm looking forward to getting into. And I think I appreciated much more this time how much Lord Edgeware Dies was sort of a test run for her doing a lot of those things well, and in the next book she's just gonna like hit it out of the park on all those things. So yeah, I actually really, really enjoyed this one. If you've never read any Agatha Christie, I think this is a perfectly great place to start because it's a really strong book, very interesting mystery, a lot of really fun components happening in it. But I think that will do it for me. If you've read this book, let me know what you thought. Did you enjoy it as much as I did? Maybe some thoughts on, you know, if you saw the various twists and stuff coming. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. And I think that's gonna do it. I hope you guys are having a fantastic day, and I will talk to you soon. Bye!